What is going on, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS4 overview. So in this video, I'm going to be doing a general PSA on firmware version spoofing on the jailbroken PS4, because this is a topic that seems to have resurfaced recently in the community, and it does appear to be causing a fair bit of confusion. Now, I believe the reason why this has come up recently is that there's like an alternative version of Hen out there. I believe it's being called Platinum Hen, which also has a firmware spoofer built in that can spoof to firmware version 10.50, apparently. That's what it's been advertised as. And generally, I wouldn't recommend running modified versions of Hen, especially not versions that were made or modified by the original developers, because there has been previous versions, modified versions of Hen in the past that have actually bricked consoles. So I would generally try and stay away from that as much as possible and only download the official Hen releases from Sistro and maybe Mira from the Open Orbis team. Those are the ones that you can trust, whereas other ones that are modified by other people, you cannot trust them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the developers behind it are acting nefariously. Maybe the code is fine, maybe it works fine, maybe they've done all the checks, but you can't verify that unless it's open source and it can be independently verified by other trusted developers. So generally, that's why I stay away from these kind of other versions of Hen, and the exploit hosts that host these alternative versions of Hen as well, I generally don't cover and I try and stay away from in my videos. But anyway, let's just address the elephant in the room, because it seems that some people are wanting to use this version of Hen because of the firmware spoofer. So the thing is, firmware spoofing is not new. It has existed in older versions of Hen. X-Vortex version of Hen from 5.05, one of those versions contained a firmware version spoofer. And to address the elephant in the room, first of all, it does not allow you to play online. You know, it's not like the PS3 firmware spoofing where you can spoof to a higher firmware and then it will allow you to access the online services. That's not the case with PS4 firmware spoofing. You still can't access PSN. There's additional checks and stuff in there, so it's not going to allow you to play online by spoofing your firmware to a higher number. All it really does is change or spoof the perceived SDK version to a higher version, which does allow you to bypass some checks on the PS4. So the main reason why firmware version spoofing was introduced in, I think, X-Vortex's version of Hen was to bypass an issue with VR devices. So PlayStation VR, there was an issue where I believe if the headset was on a higher firmware than what the PS4 was running, then it would be a mismatch and it would not allow you to actually use your PlayStation VR on your jailbroken PS4 unless you updated the firmware of your PS4. And obviously that's a problem. So by spoofing your firmware to a higher version, you could trick the VR headset into thinking that you're on the highest firmware, and it would allow you to use the device on your jailbroken PS4. That, I believe, is the main reason why firmware spoofing was added into X-Vortex's version of Hen back on 5.05, and maybe older firmwares as well, potentially. So we don't need that anymore because Gold Hen actually has VR support. If you look at the Gold Hen changelog, you will see that enable VR is an option there in Gold Hen. So Gold Hen, instead of using firmware spoofing, just manually patches that check to allow VR devices to work without having to spoof your firmware. So that's kind of solved at this point. We don't really need to use firmware spoofing for that anymore. Now, there's a few other reasons why firmware spoofing was useful. I believe in the 6.72 exploit when that came out, and it was quite unstable compared to 5.05 in the early days. So with 6.72, the people who updated would dump newer games on 6.72, and then people on 5.05 could then try and run them as a fake package on their PS4s. And obviously they wouldn't run because it required a higher firmware in order to run. So you'd get that same error message that you typically see when you install a newer game update that can't run on your firmware, where it says to run the update or to run the game, you need to update to the higher firmware. So it could kind of bypass that check with some of these fake packages by basically, you know, spoofing the SDK version to a higher version, and then it would allow you to try and run the game. But still, in most cases, the games would not run anyway, because there's generally a good reason why it's targeting that higher SDK version, because it's actually using functions and features in that new SDK version that are not present in the older SDK versions that the jailbroken PS4s are running on. You know, maybe it would get into the game, but it would crash at some other point in the game. Anytime it tried to access something in the new SDK that didn't exist in the old SDK, you would get problems, you would get crashes. And thankfully, we have people like CYB1K who can actually properly backport a game from the newer SDK version to work with the older SDK version by patching stuff out of the game that actually uses the new SDK stuff that's not present in the old one, as well as converting stuff from the new SDK that has some kind of equivalent function or equivalent feature in the old SDK and porting it over to work with that older feature or function, and actually get these games working from higher firmwares to lower firmwares. Like we can now run Dead Island 2 on 9.00 and obviously Resident Evil 4 Remake recently. So thanks to people like CYB1K, we're able to run these games, and they do not require a firmware spoof, because once it's backported to target the older SDK version, then you will no longer run into that check where it's checking for the higher SDK version and not allowing you to run the game if you're on an older firmware, because it's targeting the older SDK version with the backported version anyway. So requiring a firmware spoof for that reason is also kind of redundant now as well. And if you want to support CYB1K, I'll leave his donation links down in the video description. And there's a good reason why we would prefer to use these other solutions to fix these problems rather than spoofing the firmware version. And that's because spoofing the firmware version can actually cause more problems than it solves. So one of the main problems with spoofing your firmware version is that there's payloads and homebrew apps that check your firmware version in order to know, what memory addresses to use depending on what firmware version you're on. So if you spoof your firmware version to a different version, you could end up causing crashes when you try and run certain homebrew apps or payloads. So for example, if I spoof to 10.50 and then I run a homebrew app that checks my firmware version to make sure I'm on 9.00 in order for it to work, and then it detects that I'm on an incompatible firmware version, 10.50, then it's just not going to run properly, or it's just going to give me an error message saying I'm not on a compatible firmware. And of course, even worse, if I'm on, say, 5.05 and I spoof my firmware version to 9.00, and then I try and run a homebrew app that checks my firmware version, and it thinks I'm on 9.00, so it selects the memory addresses for 9.00 when I'm actually on 5.05, then yeah, it's probably going to crash my console, or it's going to cause any number of other problems because it's obviously loading the wrong offsets for my firmware version. So this is kind of the primary reason why Sistro, I believe, removed the firmware spoofing from Gold Hen or never included it, is mainly because of these issues. Developers basically complaining that, people are complaining to them about problems with their payload and crashing and all of this stuff, when actually the problem is that the firmware version was being spoofed to a higher version. So it was causing all of these issues. And so the general TLDR of firmware spoofing is that it causes more problems than it solves. And for the problems that it does solve, we already have other solutions to solve those problems. So spoofing the firmware version really isn't necessary in the latest versions of Gold Hen, and that's why I recommend sticking with Gold Hen and not jumping to some modified version of Hen that contains a firmware spoofer, because generally you just don't know if that version of Hen can be trusted. You don't know how it's coded. You don't know if there could be potential issues that could cause your console to get bricked under certain conditions, which has happened in the past with these modified versions. So I would highly recommend staying away from them. I would also recommend staying away from any exploit hosts that also advertise, third-party versions of the homebrew enabler. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And once again, I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.